implemented in your software. This security practice has two streams. One is focused on control verification, and one is focused on misuse abuse testing. Yes. What you'll see immediately here in SAMM is that you'll have, it's a maturity model, 3 levels of maturity. Maturity level 1, 2, and 3. And they reflect doing this kind of activity in a opportunistic way, ad hoc, in a more efficient way, becoming better at it, and then in a way that you really master that specific security practice. And within each of these streams, you have the activities. So control verification, are you testing software security controls? Do you derive test cases from security requirements? This is more efficient. And then do you perform regression testing? That is really mastering this. And so you see there's an increasing level of maturity. And that is really the structure of each of these security practices, where you have basic activities, more efficient, becoming more efficient at that activity and that security practice, and then fully mastering it. Does that mean that we are aiming for the highest level in every security practice with this maturity model? No, you have to align it on what is good enough for you. But this is the practice structure that we're using beneath or underneath that model. So how do you apply it? In the first stage, you will assess where you are, and that is specifically, as it's a maturity model, quite important. As we take the example here, and we take the first activity under control verification, testing for software security controls, that's an activity. How do we measure that? So as part of the assessment, there's a questionnaire where you're going to figure out how you're doing that. And in a way, we've designed that in a way that we're not only testing for coverage. So for each of the activities, we have a questionnaire, do you perform this activity? But not only like, okay, for how much applications or for how many developers or for how many systems, but also, do you do this in a qualitative way? Are you going to reach your objective with this particular activity? So, and that is something that has changed with the latest version. We're now in version 2. We're not only testing for coverage, like the quantitative way of doing this activity, but also for the quality of it, the criteria that are important for that particular activity. The example, remember, are you testing for the basic security controls in your software? The question is, do you test applications for the correct functioning of these standard security controls? So that's the question. And before we go into like no for some or at least half of them and everything, the quality criteria are more important. Does this mean that you at least test for authentication, access control, so that we exhaustively list the security controls we expect you to test? And not only that, whenever the application changes its use of those controls, do you retest it? So I think it's quite straightforward, but those are the quality criteria you first have to meet before we're going to answer, okay, we're not testing that, obviously then no, or for some of them or for all of our applications. And that's how we are going to measure the maturity of each of these activities. Okay? So that is in a nutshell how you can apply SAMM.
All right. I'm going to talk about mappings. And so assuming that you're using SAMM, for people who are not using SAMM, you should start using SAMM, because there are not really many alternatives if you want to measure your application security program. But then in organizations, you are definitely or most likely going to work with some existing standards like the ISO standard, ISO 27001, and other standards, NIST standards, and you want to avoid having this assessment or going through every step of the process and re-answering the same questions and filling out the assessment again and again. This is why the mappings is an effort to create a mapping between SAMM and other standards, which could help you. So you can start, you might have already compliance with the ISO standard, for instance, and then you're going to implement SAMM, or you could go also the other way around, where you're going to start with SAMM, and then at a certain moment in time, you're going to say, we want compliance with ISO, or more relevant things. In Europe, there are 2 regulations coming in place, the CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, DORA, which is applicable for financial companies. And if you are using already SAMM, there is a way to map to these standards. There is not yet a way, but we hope that will be added. But there are already quite some mappings to different standards, such as NIST standards. There is an upcoming mapping to IEC. A lot of numbers, I'm not going to say them, but this mapping is about IoT security. And there are, SAMM is about your application security program, and most of the activities, tasks, whatever it's named, whatever the terminology is in other standards, are going to also be in SAMM. And by the way, I'm not going to go too deep with the mappings. There's an excellent talk at 3:30, so basically after this presentation, by a colleague of mine, Dimitar, who's going to go in depth about mappings and different strategies to realize mappings and what you can do with that. Aside from that, so there is a project called OpenCRE, which aspires to unite all standards. So they have created sort of a central set of entities to which different standards could map to. And then once you do that, there's sort of a star structure. They can generate mappings between different standards. There are some links here. You can find the mappings. So there are two ways to do the mappings. There are direct mappings. For instance, we have done a direct mapping to NIST SSDF, which is very relevant. NIST SSDF is comparable to SAMM, but SSDF is not a maturity model. So you can't really measure. You could try to do that. You could try to figure out how you could measure your compliance with NIST SSDF, although I went through the standard and there is not a single word compliance in that standard. So I don't think they also like compliance. But then basically, the mapping looks like this. It's a direct mapping, so it's very qualitative. And NIST was also involved in this mapping, so there is, call it a stamp of approval. Although there is, we're none of the, neither OWASP, SAMM, or NIST is going to say this is approved, and if you use this, you can claim compliance. Once again, there is no such thing as compliance, neither for SAMM nor for SSDF, at least to the best of our knowledge. There is a link to that, and then there is also a link to CSF. So there is direct mapping to CSF. I think there's not much time, so, and OpenCRE, do we have a link on the slides? It's opencre.org, basically, where you can pull a standard, a framework, and then map it to another one. And it doesn't have to be SAMM, by the way. You can map between ISO 27001 and NIST 853B, for instance. And there is like 10 or 15 different frameworks in OpenCRE which you can play and use. Okay, moving on to the third part, which is about benchmarking. So Seba told you that SAMM allows you to measure your current security practices. So it's a number. You get a number, which is great. I don't know any single framework in application security which is going to give you a number and say your security practices are 50%. Our number is between 0 and 3, but I'm going to, for the sake of simplicity, let's call it a percentage. Now, one of the questions throughout these years that we had, one of the most, on the top of the list of most required/desired features was, you give us, we did the assessment, we come up with a number, 0.5 or 1 out of 3. But how good is that? How are the other organizations doing? And this is why Brian Glass, who's here on the picture, he's the lead for that project, for the benchmarking project. This is why the team came up with this idea. We're going to create a benchmark. We're going to collect assessments, and then we're going to publish this benchmark, and with which you could compare. And then now I'm going to show you the benchmark that we already have. And please, pretty please, consider, if you are doing SAMM assessments, consider donating benchmark data sets to the benchmarking project. Your data is completely anonymous. There is no real way of linking that data to you. You can submit it through an online form. For the sake of quality checks, it is nice that you would contact Brian, but you don't have to. So, I mean, if you contact Brian, he will know which organization you come from. So you could consider it as, okay, but my privacy is now gone. But yeah, a lot of the organizations are actually contacting him with a data set. So most of the data set is very qualitative. Okay, now to the benchmark. So this is sort of demographic data. And I'm going to tell you quickly, I'm not going to go through each chart here. The most important data that you have here, most of the benchmark data is based on large multinational companies, which are the top left chart and the bottom two left charts again. Large multinational companies, which is nice. You would expect like data set to be based on small companies that could convince their legal to send this data. But yeah. And then top right chart tells you the type of the assessment. So there are two sorts of ways to send your data. If you contact Brian and you're a practitioner, so you do assessments, third-party assessments for organizations, this is what we call third-party assessments. Or you could do a self-assessment. So you did the assessment yourself for your own organization, and then you send it to the benchmark. Most of the assessments are third-party assessments. What does it really mean here? We consider that these third-party assessments are going to be more qualitative. There's going to be less subjectivity in them, which is great. So you could say, I really truly believe that the benchmark data is very highly qualitative, and it really is how it is. I mean, it makes sense. And then the bottom right part is the scope of the assessment. You can do an assessment for your whole organization, or you can split it in teams, in smaller business units, or the lowest level, which would be teams. And that's a nice mix. So we have assessments in the benchmark, let's say about a third of each type. Okay, this is the benchmark, and this is the score. I'm not going to go through each and one of them. There's no time, basically. We will publish the slides, and there's another. We had SAMM user days yesterday where all sort of people came in who were interested in the SAMM model. We had interesting discussions and presentations, and there is a presentation which is just the benchmark data. The most interesting finding is the composite average, so the average score of all benchmarks, which are 30 in the data set, is 144. And you might ask, is that good or is that bad? I don't know. To be honest, the reality is probably a lot lower than that. We believe that organizations that submitted their data to the benchmarking project, most of them are doing pretty well. And I'm not going to call it like showing off, but most of them submitted data knowing like, okay, we're doing pretty well. Let's do this. And I've talked to different people yesterday, told me like, hey, the individual scores all make sense, except that for our organization, we are doing way worse than this. So I would expect that the reality, if you go and pick 10 random organizations, the score would be below 1, to be honest. So interesting findings. Operations has a pretty high score, relatively, 1.8 out of 3. And this is not really a surprise, because we know large multinational organizations have a lot of maturity in terms of operational security. Governance is somewhat lower score than expected, I would say. We expect this to be due to averaging out, because we have also small companies in the data set which are known to have very little governance, to do very little governance. And then design score is pretty high. We would think that this is thanks to the shift left ideas, the shift left philosophy. And then implementation is doing okay, again, thanks to the DevOps, DevSecOps philosophy. And then the weird thing here is the verification score is extremely low, well, compared to the rest. And it's surprising. So we have security requirements, we've shifted left, but then, so we are maybe doing the right thing, but nobody's checking whether we are doing them right. And that is surprising and not surprising at the same time. Again, everyone yesterday said, hey, we would have the same score. So everyone knows that they're doing bad at verification. I will now, so every chart, every slide I have further on is going to zoom in further and further in this. And then I told you this is an averaging. We're going to try to split out the data by some factors. And the first split is by the type of the assessment. I told you How much time do you need for the last part? Okay, thanks. I told you that we would expect the third-party assessments to be more qualitative. And to be honest, we were also expecting the third-party assessments to score lower. Because you would expect people subjectively to give themselves way more credit than they deserve. But then that is not what we see here. So the self-assessments are scoring way worse than the third-party assessments. And at this point, we suspect that this is due to the fact that if you're calling in a third-party assessment, you're going to also let the team sort of prepare for that. So, or you might call them in after you've done an initial self-assessment. And I mean, this is just conjecture, so we're not really sure about this. Yeah. Moving on, once again, a split now per type of company. So the top part is self-assessment, third-party assessment for small companies. The lower part is for the large companies, and we pull the line at, so the small company is until 100 developers. A large company is between 1,001 and 10,000, and now you should ask me, like, what about medium size? Well, I told you we take anonymity very seriously, and there is only one data set of medium-sized company, so we are not going to show that, because imagine you're talking to someone and he or she tells you, like, hey, we submitted our data to the benchmarking project, you should also do the same, and you figure out they're a mid-sized company, you immediately know their score. So yeah, interesting things. Again, well, no surprises, I would say, here for in terms of small companies scoring lower, especially on governance. Typically, smaller companies have a lot of tribe knowledge, tribe culture, and they're not going to really write a lot of documentation of their compliance and standards and policies, while this is a known thing to be handled pretty well at larger organizations. Again, verification scores very, very low, but then we also see that verification scoring in percentage-wise much lower for the self-assessments, which maybe indicates the fact that people who are scoring these verification self-assessment are not giving themselves enough credit, which completely contradicts to what we have expected, that people doing self-assessment would give themselves more credit. Okay, moving on, I want to tell you about, and probably after this I'll give it to Seba, I want to tell you about the top scoring activities and the low scoring activities. No surprises for, I would say, top scoring activities which are related to operations. These are the gray charts. So we know large organizations, which is most of the data sets, know what they're doing. They're doing a good job for operations. These are the highest scoring activities. I would say security requirements is a nice thing to see, and secure architecture as well. But then if we look at the bottom part, so security requirements is a high scorer, but requirements testing is the worst scoring activity. So we have some requirements going on, but then we are not really testing for those requirements. But then what are we exactly doing with those requirements is the question. So I would say, again, the bottom part, threat assessment is traditionally a low scorer, and we've known this for years. Security testing is about your tooling, your SAST and DAST and all these scanners, and it's weird to see that scoring low. Now, SAMM tells you that you should use those tools, but then you should tune them. And it seems that nobody's tuning tools. It's rare to see. We've also had a lot of assessment experience, so I'm not just saying this based on this data. I know I have also a lot of data at the back of my head. We know that companies, teams are using tools, but then they don't really invest a lot of time or no time in tuning the tools. And then the most shocking finding through the data set is strategy and metrics. We haven't figured out how to measure, sorry, not the strategy and metrics, the metrics. So this is a sort of combination. Strategy and metrics are two streams that are combined. So this is the average, but then the later data, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time to go through the later data in detail, but I'm going to tell you now that metrics is scoring horribly low. It's weird. We still haven't figured out how to measure our AppSec program, how to measure the success of our AppSec program. Yeah, we have here again per question. The only thing I'll tell you here is that The top part has no real surprises. We are scoring very high at maturity level 1 questions, which makes sense. And then the lower part, we are scoring very low at the highest maturity level questions. The only surprise here is that we are scoring very low on the question, are you using KPIs to improve your AppSec program? But then we are scoring higher on, are you using your KPIs to measure the success of your AppSec program? But we are scoring low on, are you using KPIs? So that's a shocker, I would say. Yeah, I'll give it back to Seba for the sake of the time.
All right, thank you. So now that you've had like a sneak preview of how this works and how you can compare yourselves, let's provide you with a couple of resources. And instead of like listing them out here, I'm going to show you where exactly you will find these. So obviously we have, you can find everything on OWASP.SAMM.org, and let me put it a little bit bigger. So if you go to the homepage here, you'll find different parts. The getting started, SAMM assessment and benchmark you'll find here. Resources here is where you can find everything in terms of tools, how to do assessment tools, how to do trainings. Aram has created a very good online training, completely free. So if you're new to this and you want to learn more, highly recommend it. The mappings part, we have a YouTube channel where most of our community calls, but also presentations are hosted. We have community sessions every second Wednesday of the month for the US, I would say, audience, and then every second Friday of the month for the European time zone. You can also download the SAMM PDF. So SAMM itself, the model you find on the website here. And so you have here the requirements-driven testing. You can find here with the different streams in here and the different maturity levels. But if you want to find, if you want to completely download it, there's also a PDF version. Don't print it; it's a huge page. And then everything we do, everything we build is based out of our GitHub repositories. And if you want to stay up to date, and I would highly recommend that if there's one action you should remember from this is to register for the newsletter. There's no spam in there. We only provide you with updates on the project and what we've been doing there. So that's the resources. What's absolutely also improved over the last couple of years is guidance on how to do assessments. So there's a complete assessment guide. There's example questions. There's extra questions for doing workshops and so on. And there's even a podcast that was done with a couple of people on how to do that. So if you're starting, that's definitely something to consider. Then last but not least, the model itself, as I said, is technology and development, I would say, paradigm agnostic, but you've added quite some guidance. So for every stream that's in there, I'm not going to show you, but you can see it here. You can find extra guidance with extra pointers to projects, to best practices, to tools, to exactly how do the activities in here. This is a link which you can also find to the training, which features Aram, obviously, where he explains all the different SAMM aspects. And then what we've also provided is we get a question a lot like, okay, we want to start with this, but we don't really know how to do this. Do you know people that can help us? Obviously, we don't know a lot of people that can help you, but instead of just like mailing you that list, we've made a list of practitioners online available that you can rely on and obviously choose yourselves. We are a community-driven project. We have lots of people that are using the project, the outcome, but also contributing, providing feedback, input on this release, but also on future releases. And if you're interested in contributing, well, please get in touch with us. There's no excuse not to get in contact with us. There's lots of communication channels. So we have the GitHub discussions available. We have our dedicated Slack channel. We have our newsletter, and then, like I said, we have every second Wednesday of the month we have a meetup. So we have a dedicated meetup for that. So do register on that, and then you'll get an invitation for the next one. Everything is on the website, and obviously we want to thank our sponsors and supporters for making this possible. Obviously we rely on volunteers, but we have also things to run, and we have some people doing some UX and technical writing and so on. So that is definitely useful. And then as a last call to action, if you like this and you want to come to the next user day, so as part of every global AppSec, we are doing some user days. It's a full day of presentations, but also workshops and roundtables on OWASP SAMM. The next global AppSec in Europe is in Barcelona. So the 14th of May, you're more than welcome to join us there. And I think in Washington, D.C., it will be in November. There also, the next Wednesday, then there will be a user day. So do feel free to join us there, and I hope to see you there. And with that, I think we are just half an hour. Yes. Yeah. So if you have any questions.
Can we swap people, because I've got a whole meeting queued up there.
Yes. Do find us in the hallway, and then enjoy the rest of the conference.